In this particular video session, what we're looking at is actually how wages are determined. In previous video sessions, we discussed what wages were and also what the real wage was. Now, in this particular video session, we're going to look at how it is actually determined. Now, the fact of the matter is that a real wage, or the wage in itself, is a price. It is the price of labor, services, and it means that it is determined, therefore, in the free market like any other price. It means, therefore, we'll be utilizing the concepts of demand and supply. The market is the labor market, and therefore, what we'll be looking at is the demand for labor, the supply of labor, and therefore be looking at the unique price that will result in equilibrium within the labor market. And this unique price will be the equilibrium wage rate. So, in seeking to draw up these models, we first must ask ourselves the question, who demands labor and for what? Well, the answer is simple. Firms demand labor because labor is one of the factors that are used in the production process. As a result, it means that whenever a firm wants to expand production, they may seek to hire more workers, because more workers mean greater level of inputs and therefore a greater level of outputs in terms of production. But the converse is also true, in that if firms choose to produce less output, let's say as a result of a fall in sales, then they may not need as much workers as they had before, and therefore this may lead to some retrenchment of workers. Alright, so some of the workers may actually be retrenched. Now, we have therefore highlighted who demands labor and why, but we now must ask ourselves the question, what is the relationship that we expect to occur or exist between the real wage and the demand for labor? And the answer is that the relationship between the real wage and the demand for labor is inverse or negative, which means that as the real wage rises, the demand for labor falls, and when the real wage falls, the demand for labor rises. Why is this? The answer is simple. Remember, we said that the real wage is a cost. It is a cost to the firm. And if it is a cost, it means the higher the cost, the lower the demand for the product. The lower the cost, the higher the demand for the product. As a result of this, seeing as real wage is that cost or that price, the lower the real wage, the cheaper it is, for firms to demand workers. And therefore, there's a high demand for labor when the real wage is low. But the higher the real wage, the more expensive it is to hire every new unit of labor. Therefore, the lower the demand. So therefore, we see an inverse or a negative relationship existing between the real wage and the demand for labor. So, despite the fact that firms need labor in order to produce, we must understand that there is a cost attached to each worker that is hired, and that cost is the real wage. It therefore means that when hiring workers, firms have to weigh the cost versus the benefit of an extra worker. And therefore, when we talk about the cost or the extra cost and the extra benefit, what we're looking at is the marginal productive labor, which is the additional output that is added to total output when we hire a new worker. Alright, that's marginal product. And then the marginal cost, also known as the real wage, is the additional cost that is added to the firm's total cost when an additional worker or a new worker is hired. And in this case, the marginal cost is actually the real wage, because every time a firm hires an additional worker, they must pay that new worker a wage rate. And therefore it means each new worker means another wage has to be paid, and that of course is the marginal cost, the change in your total cost each time you hire a new unit of labor. Now let's see if we could graph this relationship. So we're going to assume some values and see the relationship that occurs. What we're saying here in this particular diagram is that the first worker, for whatever firm this represents, this particular worker contributes 180 units. So the first worker contributes 180 units to output. And therefore, if this is the first worker, before this first worker there was no workers, and therefore there would have been 0 total output. So therefore, the 180 units that this worker produces is therefore the total output after having hired one person. When we look at the second worker adds 150 units to total output, and therefore means that 150 plus 180 gives you a total output of 330 units after having hired 2 workers. So we see here that the first worker contributes 180 units to total output. The second worker contributes 150 units to total output. So after having hired 2 workers, 330 units are produced in total by this particular firm. The third worker contributes 120 units. And therefore, total output after the third worker will be 330 plus 120, which gives you a value of 450. And we can continue this process going all the way down. We see after the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th worker, they each respectively contributed 100, 80, 70, and 50. And ultimately, we get the total output by saying after the third worker, the total output of 450 plus 100 from the fourth worker gives us a total of 550 units after the fourth worker. Then the total output after the fifth worker is going to be 550 plus 80, going to give us 630. And then for the sixth worker, the total output will be 630 plus 70 gives us 700. And then the total output after the seventh worker is going to be 700 plus 50 gives us 750. So we have the total output column and we have the marginal product of labor column. And as stated earlier, this particular column records the output that each new worker adds to the total output. Alright, so this middle column here, it records the additional output that a new worker adds to the total output of a firm. Now, it should be possible for us to plot these values. And that's what we have here. We have a demand for labor curve. It's actually your marginal product of labor curve. And it's downward sloping from left to right. We see here the first laborer contributes 180. First laborer. So the x-axis records the workers that will be hired, and the y-axis records actually the actual output of each worker. Now, what we need to realize is, remember, firms pay with their workers actually what they contribute in real terms. Alright? So if a firm pays their workers what they contribute, it means that when a worker produces, this first worker produces 180 units, it means that's the cost that the firm has to bear when that worker creates that amount of units. Secondly, when the second worker produces 150 units, the real wage therefore is also going to be 150 units. So what we realize is that as more and more workers are hired, the output that each new worker adds gets less and less. We see that here. The first worker put 180, the second worker 150, the third worker 120, and going all the way down, we see that the values that each new worker contributes gets less and less. And that's natural. I mean, sometimes the fact is that when you have a fixed number of resources and you keep adding more and more workers, it's a saying, there's a saying that I know that too many hands, spoil the broth. Too many cooks spoil the broth, meaning that it's one pot, and too many cooks hovering this one pot will have more wastage than actual production and productivity. Similarly, what we're saying here is that when capital and other assets and equipment are limited and a firm keeps on hiring more and more workers, it means each new worker may add less and less because it may actually have some idle workers, or because a worker doesn't have sufficient capital and resources and equipment, they can't work as fast or as much or as productive. So that's the rationale that we're seeing here that as a firm hires more and more workers from 1 to 7, each new worker adds less and less to the total output of the firm. More so, what we realize is that because they're adding less, it also means that the real wage is declining, because the real wage is the money wage expressed in terms of the units of a good. And this column here represents what the firm would actually have to pay the worker, because the firm pays the worker what they actually contribute. So the marginal product of labor curve is actually the demand curve for labor. And the rationale is simple. As a firm hires more and more workers, the real wage that the firm has to pay to acquire that worker gets less and less, which means the lower the real wage, the more firms demand. But the higher the real wage, the less firms will demand, and therefore it gives rise to a negatively or downward sloping demand for labor curve, as basically when prices or the real wage rises, the demand for labor falls. And alternatively, when the real wage falls, the demand for labor rises. So we have expressed and therefore drawn our demand for labor curve. And we can look at the supply of labor also. The supply of labor comes from households. Households supply their labor to firms so that they can acquire an income that could be used to purchase the goods and services that they desire in society. When households are not working, it means that they are engaging in leisure activities, and as a result, it means households must be given an incentive to forfeit leisure and come out to work, and that incentive is in fact the real wage. Hence, what we can say is the higher the real wage, then more people will be willing to work. Whereas the lower the real wage, the smaller the incentive, or the less the incentive there is to come out and work. So we see that there is in fact a direct or positive relationship that exists between the real wage and the supply of labor. This should give rise to an upward sloping supply curve of labor, which we see in this particular diagram. So, whereas with the first worker, the real wage is 180. At a real wage, so let's look at it this way. At a real wage of 180, firms will demand one worker, but 7 workers will be willing to supply their services. At a real wage of 150, the firm will demand 2 workers, but 6 workers will be willing to supply their services. And we could go down the line. So as the real wage decreases, more units of labor will be demanded by the firm. However, less workers will be willing to work at that wage, because they may be possibly saying that wage, the lower the real wage, the less my incentive to come out and work. It's too little, so I won't work. So as the real wage falls, firms demand more from 1 to 7, but as the real wage falls, laborers supply less of themselves to work. Now, since we have the demand for labor curve and the supply for labor curve, what we can in fact show is the equilibrium position, which we see here in the diagram, with the demand for labor curve being downward sloping from left to right, which is yellow, and the supply of labor curve, which is upward sloping from left to right. And again, we see this relationship. And at this point here, we see equilibrium. And equilibrium occurs where $100 will therefore be the equilibrium real wage, and at that real wage, 4 workers will be willing to supply their services, and 4 workers will actually be demanded by the firm. And we see that here, and it's highlighted in our table. So the 4th worker actually contributes 100 units to the firm, and that is the cost that the firm actually has to pay, because if 100 units are produced, 100 units will therefore be paid, and therefore 4 workers will be hired by this firm. So the equilibrium real wage is actually going to be 100 units. In the subsequent video presentation, what we're actually going to show now is how wages going to in fact impact employment and output within the economy. Stay tuned for more videos. Thank you.